All right, here we are coming live to you from room 306, the impact of Reconstruction. Now this is going to be a rather lengthy video because there are a lot of important things that we need to look at. So we're going to look at how successful the whole Reconstruction program was, to what extent was it successful in some areas and not the others, and then how it kind of impacted the lives of freedmen on three different levels. Right, so if we're looking at the three different levels, sometimes I refer to them as the three keywords of social studies, because a lot of times you're always asked, how does something impact people in this way or in that way, right? And then I give you some silly ways of remembering them. So the first one is political, right? So what was the political impact, meaning, what laws were passed, what amendments were passed, and the image we use to memorize that, or at least picture that, is a ballot box. The second keyword is economic. Anything that has to do with a job. So we were talking about the economic impact of the Civil War in the South. That would be, the destroyed plantations, because that has to do with business. And the last one is social, right? That would just be, if you think social butterfly, right? The day-to-day lives of people. So how happy are they? How unhappy are they? What's the social impact? Meaning, how did it impact people on a personal level? All right, so we're looking at, during Reconstruction, thanks to the 14th Amendment, African Americans are now given the right to vote, but the South is going to go about, let me get my magic pen, the South is going to try and keep them from voting three different ways, all right? And you do have to know the three. The first one is poll taxes, all right? Now, taxes we know are you have to pay something in order to be able to do it, so this is simply, you have to be able to pay a tax in order to vote. Right, so you go to vote, they charge you money, right? Here's the key concept, is that most African Americans are freedmen. They don't have jobs, they don't have land, right? So they don't have any money. So of course they're not going to be able to vote. But you may have some African Americans that do have money and are able to vote, so southern state governments have to try something else. So the second thing they try is a literacy test, right? Literacy test is simply the ability to read and write. Right, so you show up to the voting booth, you have to demonstrate the ability to read and write in order to be able to vote. And it is usually some tricky part of the Constitution that even an educated person would have difficulty understanding and deciphering. All right, and then the key idea here is slave owners didn't want their slaves being able to read and write. So these former slaves, they never developed the right or the ability to read and write. But thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau, you do start having more and more former slaves getting the ability to vote. And the last way is grandfather clauses. And that simply means that if your grandfather or if a relative could vote before that year, 1867, then you're allowed to vote. Right? So I have a little family tree there for you. Now, quite simply, could slaves vote before 1867? No. So there were no African Americans in the South voting before that time. Right, and then I kind of, this is always a interesting photo because it does show a former slave going to vote, right, and you have Southerners that are trying to keep them from voting. Now, these were just some of like the legal ways that Southern governments try to keep them from voting. In the next video, we're going to look at some of the illegal ways, like the KKK, using fear to try and keep them from voting. Now, just to kind of throw it all together, right, each of these methods was designed to keep former slaves from voting, and each one was a little bit more strict than the other. Because if you look at the poll taxes, are you going to have some poor whites that can't pay? Absolutely. So we got to find something else. The whole idea was for Southern governments to keep African Americans from voting, but still to allow as many whites to vote as possible. All right. Continuing on, we march on. Here's your first question. All right. So hit pause if you have to. Well, you're definitely going to have to because there's no way you can write fast enough to keep up with me, right? But how did Southern state governments attempt to keep them from voting? What are three ways they used? So there's your hint. What are three ways they used? All right, continuing on. Okay, how did they try and keep them powerless? So now we're looking at it from a social perspective, maybe an economic perspective as well, whereas the other ones were a little bit more political. Okay, they passed these terrible things called black codes. Right, and they were simply aimed at trying to limit the freedom, limit the rights, because even though the federal government's trying to give freedmen rights, the southern state governments are given the ability to enforce it, and they choose not to. Right, remember, this is 100 years of living, and now all of a sudden they're expected to change. Right, it's not exactly easy. right, led to what are known as the Jim Crow laws. All right, so if we look at some of the pictures down here, I have some examples for you. All right, they couldn't assemble without the presence of a white person, meaning they couldn't, have a family get-together, right, in some states. I know we're kind of shaking our heads like, really? That's the way life was back then, right? It was very strict. Freedmen weren't allowed to carry weapons. They weren't allowed to be taught to read and write, which, falls into that literacy test thing, all right? Now we get into a couple tricky concepts. The first one is segregation, right? And that simply means to separate by race, okay? Blacks on one side, whites on the other, Asians on one side, whites on the other, anything like that. A Supreme Court case that popped up at the time was Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And what Plessy versus Ferguson said, and the key phrase here is separate but equal, meaning you're allowed to separate things by races, they just have to be equal. So you can have two separate schools, they just have to be equal. And I got an interesting photo on the next slide. But as always, I'm the self-professed king, so let me give myself a little crown, the self-professed king of silly ways of remembering things. So here are two silly ways of remembering things. First one, separation, segregation. They have the little SE in front of them. So you need to just kind of put that in your brain. Whenever I say segregate, you should be thinking separate by races, right? I don't know why people choose to use the big fancy words, but you will see the big fancy words, so you do have to know what the big fancy word means. The second one, Supreme Court case. When you get to high school and you're taking 11th grade U.S. history, you're going to have to know Supreme Court cases like the back of your hand. So here's how you're going to remember Plessy, right? Plessy, aside from sounding like the Loch Ness Monster, right, which is Nessie, you have two S's, and I drew a circle around each of the S's. One S is going to stand for separation. The other S is going to stand for segregation. So Plessy versus Ferguson had to do with segregation. You're welcome for those tips. Right? The civil rights movement in the 1960s, that's with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks with the bus, right? This whole idea of separation by races continues until the 1960s. And the Supreme Court case that is going to begin the process of civil rights for all is Brown versus Board of Education. Simply challenged the idea of separate but equal. Supreme Court cited, said that segregation was illegal, so we no longer, 1954 begins the process. And those of you that have seen the movie Remember the Titans, right? You had the white school, you had the black school, they were put together, they were integrated, all right, which is the opposite of segregate. So if you're looking at synonyms and antonyms, those two would be antonyms. You're welcome, Mrs. Elston. Okay, now look at this picture. We have two water fountains. One has a sign over it that says whites, the other has a sign over it that says colors, right? I don't know about you, but those aren't two equal water fountains, okay? One is looks like it could be a little on the dirty side, looks like it could be broken, not sturdy, wobbly, whatever. This one over here looks pristine, 100% pure working order, but according to the Supreme Court, they were equal because they both provided you with water. The water isn't any better depending on the two, but definitely the appearance and the setup is going to be different. But Supreme Court says it's okay because they are equal. All right, here's your second key question. What were the black codes and how did they impact the lives of African Americans? Think about Jim Crow laws. How did that impact the daily lives of people in the South, specifically African Americans? And the last stage, okay, what were the good things? What were the bad things? Right? We looked at the good things are really going to be the Reconstruction Amendments. So we're going to kind of focus a little bit on the failures, right? But towards the end, a lot of Northerners lost interest, all right? And that's kind of where the push was, because we know that Southerners weren't really interested in Reconstruction. It was the Northerners. So a lot of things are going on that kind of start to distract people. We have corruption in the president's administration. Scandals start to pop up, and people start being concerned with that. The Panic of 1873, that's not going to be a good thing. That's an economic period where people are suffering. They're losing money. They're losing land. They're losing homes and businesses. All right, so if your day-to-day life is impacted, you're not really going to care too much about somebody else's. And then we do have westward expansion, which we're going to be looking at in the next unit. All right, so there's my little note there that if you're worried about your own life, you're going to stop really caring. I mean, not to sound mean, but you're not going to really care all that much about what's going on in the South. All right, Reconstruction comes to an end with the election of 1876. All right, Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican candidate. Samuel Tilden is the Democratic candidate. Now, I love looking at electoral maps because it does give you a ton of information. All right, if you look down here, the blue represents Rutherford B. Hayes. The red represents Samuel Tilden. Now, we should know at this point, because we learned in 7th grade how the election process works, it doesn't work on the number of votes you get. It works on the number of electoral votes you get. So the bigger the state, the more votes it has. So looking at this map, kind of looks like it's even, and it actually, turns out that way. So if we look at electoral votes, they both get 50% of the electoral vote, right? And that doesn't happen all that often. Right, even the popular vote. So this would be votes that, when someone came out of the voting booth, who'd you vote for, Hayes or Tilden, right? And they started counting up all the votes, all right, in which case in this one, Samuel Tilden won. But it doesn't go by popular vote. It goes by electoral vote. So we do have a tie. What next? Well, it goes to Congress, the House of Representatives, to decide. So we come up with a compromise, right, which is simply an agreement between two groups of people, all right? So you have the Democrats and the Republicans in the House that are trying to, work this out. They agree that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, would be the winner if the following conditions were met. Right? The military districts in the South, they are dismantled, troops are removed. The South is given federal money in order to try and rebuild the railroads, because if you remember from the Civil War, the railroads are destroyed. Right? More funds are given to the South for specific building projects all around, and Hayes would have to appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. All right, and then they had to. The Southern governments in return would tell the Democrats in the South that they needed to respect the rights of African Americans, which would mean no more Jim Crow laws. But there's no way of enforcing that, so that continues. All right, and then here's your last key question. Right, how did Reconstruction end? What was the biggest failure? I'll give you a hint. Was Reconstruction successful in protecting rights of African Americans? The answer is no.